We're going to kind of pick up where we left off last time. I spent some time looking at the use cases we put together last time and sort of translated them into user stories. So I wanted to go through there and just make sure that we've captured all the user stories that there are, and also to begin the process of prioritizing them, and if we have enough time to start on that process. So I did want to step back to last week's notes for just a minute.
I added and edited a couple of things in the table that you just created, and so feel free to roll back any of the changes if you think that they're unfocused.
I thought that was fantastic. I'm glad that you did that. So I hope others feel free to also edit any of the documents. I start creating them outside of the meeting just to make it a little more productive while we're together. So the one thing, I haven't really changed anything on the use case page, except that I did add a little more description based on our tail end of the conversation last time, where Rob was bringing up having a common ontology or a common format that we use in the process of what comes back from like a search API. So Rob, do you want to take a minute and just describe what, this is sort of a summary that we did outside of the meeting in some email exchanges, and I don't know if Rob, if you want to do a little bit of a summary on this to make sure that we captured everything correctly.
Sure. So the discussion was around the lines of what did I mean by format, and does that mean XML or does that mean ontology or whatever? And it's of course a bit of both, that you need to have some way of encoding a model, but you also need a model. So there needs to be, assuming we went with linked data, you would need to pick which fields from which ontologies were important, such as SCOS pref label, but equally, that could also be DC title. And we would want to pick a format or media type, such as JSON or XML or Turtle. And the fewer of each of those, the better, both for documentation purposes and implementation purposes. The fewer choices that there are, the less work it is for everyone.
Sure. So there were a couple of things that jumped out at me as part of our conversation that I'd just like to highlight. One is that the proposal is that internally you could store your data in the way that's meaningful for your organization, and that this would be a common format / ontology that you would map to. So the common part would happen as part of the search results, but not necessarily on how you store your data internally. And the other piece was that really jumped out at me was the idea that by having a common definition of a field, and what does it mean? That means that when we go across authorities that say that they use this same field, it means the same thing in each of the authorities. So those are two things that really jumped out at me as pertinent, I think, for our discussions. So I don't know, does anyone have any questions about this or any comments that they want to make?
Sorry, Lynette. Hi, Tiziana is speaking.
Hi.
Hi. Just to understand, do you mean a sort of cross-mapping between different ontology and different data sources? For example, what we call preferred term, preferred name in ShareVD means blah, 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 and the map with what info in VIAF, for example, is named blah, blah, blah. Do you mean something like this?
So I do think we mean something like this. I think preferred label might be a little more challenging, because the preferred label, the kind of definition you could give on it is that it is the preferred label for this particular thing. So in one case, that might be a name. In another case, that might be a place. So I think something like preferred label is very generic, but if you say something like birth date, that those would have a tighter common definition. I don't know, Rob, if you have something in mind to address that as well.
Yeah, that's basically it. That if we can't come up with a shared understanding of what we mean by preferred label, then I don't see how we can search for labels, which of course is the end goal, right? So, and the same with birth dates. If we have one system knows about dates, another system knows about birth and death, then how do we coherently perform a search for someone who was alive at a certain point in time, or has particular birth and death dates? So yes, having some degree of consistency between data sets, I think, is the most important aspect of this.
So can I ask a question, Ms. Nancy? As a provider for an institution that uses our own internal ontology, which makes it harder for everybody else to use it, what are you talking, and I just want to clarify, and this may be a stupid question, but are you talking about mapping in the OWL, something that says, you know, so for example, our mesh v descriptor would be mapped as OWL, same as preferred label. Is that what you're talking about? Or are you talking about something? So because Lynette was saying that we would not have to change our internal structure. Is that all you're talking about having a provider do?
Well, I think, yeah, the implementation is, of course, something that we can discuss. The way that I've seen this done most effectively elsewhere is that there is each provider does a mapping of their data into the common set of terms, set of properties. So the providers wouldn't change how they store the data. You know, obviously you can keep storing it as mark, you can keep storing it in the mesh syntax, but and also they don't need to change how they make it available, and that, you know, also you can keep providing it as mark and via ld.loc.gov as RDF. But everyone adds another way of accessing it, which is the common syntax, so that then consumers know when they ask for a particular format that they're going to get back something consistent, and probably not as rich as the internal format, but at least consistent across the different providers, meaning that then when all of those records are aggregated together for whatever purpose, then they all are, you know, mean the same thing. Or equally, when they query based on the semantics of the common syntax, they know that they're asking the same sort of search, rather than having to come up with, you know, one different search for each different provider.
So how are you thinking that this would be implemented and or enforced? I mean, because you need buy-in, right, in order to get this to work. So how would you, beyond this group, right? How are you thinking, or is that something that you think this group should do?
Right. I think this group is an excellent start towards that. That if LC and you guys and Getty and etc. Are providing the format, and there's at least a couple of useful consumers, such as a gateway into OpenRefine and the editors that are being worked on for the linked data for, well, I still think of it as linked data for libraries, but whatever it's called now. LD4L projects are working on. Then, as we've seen with things like IIIF, everyone sees the benefits and the cost of implementation is low. So they go ahead and do it, and the snowball starts to grow. So it's really, to me, about having the core institutions involved from the beginning so that their use cases are met, and I think they are, such that then other people see the benefits of working together and do so.
So I would note that questioning authority has been serving part of this scenario. So it doesn't really, it doesn't handle the case where you know that one field means exactly the same thing as another field, but it does normalize the format so that when it comes to the application, it always has a URI, it always has a label, and the extended context isn't exactly the same for every authority, but it is presented in the same way for every authority so that the consuming application finds it easier to work with that data. So that's part of what I think this area is trying to handle, but it doesn't get to that deeper level of saying that if you define birth date in one and another authority is using birth date, they actually mean the same thing. So I think this does take it to an even deeper level. I will say that the next part we're going to look at is user stories, and it includes some of the user stories from here. And so we'll go through and do some prioritization as part of that process, and that will help us to just sort of refine what are we going to tackle as part of this group. Because there's a number of things that we can work on. Some of them are going to take longer to do than others. And so I think sort of having an idea of what is most important to all the stakeholders in this, from the catalogers to the developers to the providers, that's going to help to drive where we go with this particular group. So unless there's like another detailed question about this specific piece, I think we could go ahead and move on, but I'll leave it open for just another minute to see if there are more questions here.
Hi, this is Kevin. I don't know if I have so much a question as I just wanted to throw out there that listening to this, I mean, how do I say this? I see the ready value of coming up with a common set of attributes that can be mapped to specific data attributes in order to kind of equalize search or the way people access it. But there's also a part of me that, you know, listening to what you were saying, Rob, is I kept thinking in my head, CQL, or SRU. And, you know, to some degree, I feel like it's been done before. I mean, not necessarily in a linked data environment, but that there's a pattern for this. And anyway, what I started wondering was, you know, the general direction of this project and the charter and the idea behind it. And, you know, one of the things that it started with was the painful experience of dealing with multiple data providers, each of whom offered a different variation on the same API, and each entity offering a slightly different response. And then you had to develop tooling to deal with id.load.gov versus Getty versus AgriVoc, so on and so forth. And there's a part of me that just wonders if we all got the same, you know, if we focused on the same response from every service, and then built up to whether or not there was a way to commonly map data attributes, if that would help break this out versus going after this valuable but very, very big objective.
Given, could you say a little bit more about the what you meant by the response being the same? Do you mean a wrapper like SRW, SRU, or do you mean the actual data about the vocabularies for the vocabularies themselves?
So I'll interject just real quick before you respond. That from the perspective of questioning authority, the thing that makes an authority easy to work with is if it's in linked data. So it doesn't even matter like what representation of linked data it is, whether it's JSON LD or RDF XML. Just by virtue of being in linked data, it provides a very easy mechanism to do a configuration that maps the linked data to what we want to actually display in the application.
Right. With respect to Rob's question, I'm talking about the actual response from the service. So, you know, if you hit an API for a suggest service for id.loc.gov versus the suggest service for Getty or Agravoc or any other service that operates one, you're likely going to get a different response format from each one of those services. And so I guess the question I'm asking is whether or not if we focused on the format of the response kind of narrowly, if it would be more fruitful and step kind of backwards into the bigger question of what you're talking about, Rob.
Yeah. So the SRW record response essentially, as opposed to what goes into the record data fields, or otherwise I'm missing how we would have a format that's with no data elements.
Well, how do I say this? So right now, JSON ID, I'm most familiar with ID.loc.gov, obviously. So if I'm speaking from that perspective, it's just has to do with, you know, my familiarity with it. ID.loc.gov offers a custom response to its suggest service. It's not JSON. It's not JSON LD. It's not linked data. It's just a JSON response that we've had for basically a decade. That JSON response for a suggest service is different than the response you would get if you hit an open, refined, compliant API endpoint. And it's different than you would get from some other suggest service. And, you know, one of the ideas that I thought was behind this is is if there's no common response from linked data services to a suggest service, everyone has to, you know, create this custom code to deal with individual response formats. And that's what I'm talking about. I don't know if we're missing each other or I'm not understanding, but.
I think we are maybe just at different levels. That
Oh, we're totally at different levels. You're thinking much bigger. You know, you're starting at the point where, you know, you're starting at the point where you're looking at different data sets and how to say that the pref label of this one is the same as the pref label of that one. And I'm starting from basically the opposite end, which is, you know, if someone were building an application that interacted with the linked data service, how could they build it so that they didn't have to deal with bespoke responses from each one from a purely format level?
Yep. Yep. So yeah, essentially, let me drop the link into the chat. That's probably the easiest way to, I think, make this distinction. So that link should take you to.
Oh, right, and right. This is exactly what I mentioned.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So in SRU, there is this record data field, and it's just essentially a bag in which you put stuff. So regardless of what you put into that field, you've still got all of the other things that wrap around it. And I was talking about the internal stuff, and I think you're talking about the external, the stuff a lot at the same level as record data. So record schema, record packing, position, blah, blah, blah.
Right. I mean, I actually thought that some of what you were talking about more closely aligns with CQL, which often goes hand in hand with SRU.
Yeah.
And all I'm saying is SRU is a perfectly viable response format, but it's not the type of linked data format that that we might be talking about here, that Lynette's talking about.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. No, I think so long as there is a simple Dublin core version of an authority record, and it could just be simple Dublin core, then yeah, the interactions are important, and if the extent to which we can come up with a lingua franca is we'll just use SCOS, or we'll just use Dublin core, or we'll just use something custom, then that's fine. And then it comes down to, well, and then how do you do the interactions so, in the same vein as CQL and SRU. So no, I think we're talking at this. We're not talking at cross purposes. I think we're reading from different pages of the same hymn book.
Right. Like I said, I think we're looking at it from two separate angles to get to the same point eventually, type of thing. But I think that's a good way to phrase it. I mean, to the group as a whole, not necessarily to decide right now, but to bear in mind as we're going through this is what's more important right now, a common language of interactions or a complete lingua franca at the data level.
The extent of franca.
Right.
So I would like to maybe step back for a minute because the sort of user stories I think that we have laid out in the other document might help refine some of this discussion. It includes some of the user stories from here, and we can always expand the user stories. And I think that will help to sort of, from all the levels, it will help us to start refine where we want to spend most of our time and energy. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and cut over to the other document. And again, I want to thank Christine for adding a few things. And if someone else comes up with some user stories they want to add, it would be great to have those expanded here. And as we go through, we can also add some. So don't hesitate to just stop me at any point and we can add another user story. There's a couple of things I want to point out about the document before we get started. Eventually we're going to fill out the required column, and instead of breaking this down into like priorities, which a lot of people do, I like to break it down into more of a must. It's something that must be in place in order for the system to work. A should, it's something that should be there because it will make the system more usable and useful. And a may, which is like, well, this is optional. It would be nice if we have it, but we don't have to have it in order for this to really work for us. And so you'll see the required column and then also the user story. And the other way that I broke it apart is based on sort of the role people play. So I have all the cataloger stories together, all the developer stories together, and all the provider stories together. That way we can kind of capture it from each level, what's important. It strikes me that ultimately what we are trying to do is make this work for catalogers, and everything that the developers and the producers do is how do we funnel everything up to that level. But the perspective of what's desired at each level is going to vary based on what role you're playing. So I broke these apart as well to the use cases that we had last time. So you'll see the headers are basically mapping to the use cases that we defined last week. So with that said, I have to say that I'm kind of going back and forth whether we should just read through a bunch of them and then start working on the required column, or if we should read through all of them and start working on the required column. I think it's a lot to keep in your mind at once to try and go through all of them. So I'm sort of inclined to read a few at a time and then think about them in terms of how people feel about what's required and not required. And just knowing that as you see more, it may shift your perspective on these topics, and we can always go back. So I think we'll maybe read like 3 or 4 of them at a time and then just see where people are with each one.
I had a sort of general question about the cataloger use cases. A lot of times you're talking about selecting terms, and and I guess the way the language is constructed, you're often using entity to refer to like a work or an instance, but the thing that you're looking up is a term. And I guess I wanted to know if that was a deliberate choice or if that was just to sort of reflect how catalogers talk about this sort of thing right now. Because I think one thing that it's been hard to get catalogers to wrap their heads around is that they're not actually selecting necessarily an authoritative term, depending on the source that they're using. They might just be selecting an entity that happens to have a preferred term in English, a preferred term for this purpose or that. Obviously with the LC entities, you know, you're going to have a lot of preferred terms, but in, you know, Wikidata or ISNI, that's not necessarily the case. So I guess I just wanted to raise that as a thing, because when I went through these, I sort of like that, it was sort of hard to, I kept bumping into that as I was trying to think this through, but I didn't want to like go and edit all of your prose.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, because a lot of the things that are coming up in authorities are also entities. And so I was kind of struggling with how do you make that distinction, because if you use entity for everything, then I think it makes it a little more challenging to express. So I could, instead of saying authoritative term, it could be authoritative entity. It's just having that authoritative is the way to like say this is something we're bringing in from outside.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we just say external entity or something like that, just to distinguish between like, you know, I mean, I think what the lens that we're seeing, I assume that the lens that you're seeing this through is, you know, someone's working in Sinopia or some other metadata editor, they're using QA to select a term from a resource that isn't, you know, internal to that system.
Yes, and that's partially because that's what this specific use case is. So this use case is that a user wants to find a URI of an entity from within a metadata editor. And so even that's kind of ambiguous, a URI for an external entity from within an editor. So I definitely am doing it. My lens is from the Sinopia QA. But if there's some different language we can use, just let's all work together and we can clarify it so that it makes sense to everybody.
Well, not to take this further down the rabbit hole, but isn't the difference that what catalogers are generally looking for is the authoritative label when they're doing cataloging, and that's different from the real world object entity. So when I think Wikidata, I think I'm looking at a real world object. I'm not looking at a preferred label or an authoritative label. And so that's the difference. So to me, at least, and you said, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because it will become a rabbit hole, but I'm fine with your talking about authoritative entities, because to me, or authoritative terms, because to me, that's what the cataloger is actually looking for. Unless creating an authority record and they want to add real world object entities.
Yeah, and I will say that within the Sinopia QA sort of sphere of things, we do use the LC and AF real world objects in some cases. So sometimes from some perspectives, it is the authority object and sometimes it's the real world object. So I think that already is in this area. So again, I would just say that if a particular user story is not quite right, you know, this is just my sort of mind dump. So we can tweak this definitely and make sure the wording makes sense to everybody. So maybe we need to take them one at a time. That way we can do some editing on the language at the same time. So the first one is, as a cataloger, I want to edit an entity, which is an example is a work or an instance. It could be something else, and add metadata about the entity from authoritative sources. And I give a couple of examples. So 2 questions here. Is there any wording change we need to make to this user story? And the other would be, is this a must, should, or may?
In terms of the language, you're saying when you say add metadata, you mean link to an external URI and perhaps bring in metadata like a preferred label, right? I think it might be worth being. I know that it runs the risk of making this like overly specific or wordy, but it might be worth being specific about that, because I think add metadata is very, very broad. I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking this, but that looks great.
Yeah, that would have been my comment as well. So I think the new wording is much clearer. Thank you, Juanette.
So how is that as an adjustment? Add metadata by linking to an external URI and displaying a label from an authoritative source.
Or even just add a link to, you can delete metadata.
Say that again?
You could just have add a link to an external URI. Or, yeah.
I could make it into two separate things. I think that displaying the label is what often happens. And so I would like to either leave it as part of this line or make a second line that says something about displaying the label. Because in the systems that I've seen, they don't, perhaps they show the URI as well, but they definitely show the label.
Well, in the case of Sinopia, when you're not looking something up and you're just inserting a URI, it doesn't show a label. Like, yeah, I think picking those apart, even though that seems like overly, like it seems really specific, but I actually really like the idea of picking those apart.
Okay.
Because I think they serve different purposes.
Yeah, the cataloger is adding a link to the record. And then what the system does with that is up to the system. It might display the URI, or it might display a label for the URI, or the cataloger might have to enter, also enter the label or not. So I think there's some good recategorization here that would make it easier to understand.
So now I have them in two. Does this second, let's see, I want to edit an entity and display a label from an external authoritative source.
So do you want, when you're editing it, are you adding a label?
So Rob, I don't know if what I'm about to say is going to confuse matters more or not, but for whatever it's worth, where these where this is coming from, when like Sinopia and the BibFrame editor, when catalogers are using it, they don't see the URIs or links. That's effectively what they're doing. Don't get me wrong, that's effectively what they're doing. They're adding links in the data. They're linking it all together, but they're working on a label level. So from their mindset, they're associating a label with the resource, even though under the hood, it's getting linked together.
So as a cataloger, they don't actually want to add links to external URIs. They want to find external labels and add them, and that happens to have a URI.
Correct. They got a book in front of them and a name on it, and all they want to do is find that name so that they can, you know, for the lack of a better word, decorate the description better. Right. But it's the system under the hood that actually is applying the URI.
Yep.
Right, but I think you do want to get, Kevin, to that they want more than just, they do want more than the label. I mean, they want the system to apply the URI, even though they're not seeing it, right?
Oh, absolutely. I'm just saying that from their perspective, you know, as a cataloger, I know exactly the authoritative term I want to add as metadata about an entity. I mean, from their perspective, they know the term they want to add. Now, in reality, they find the term and they select it, and under the hood, the URI is assigned. But from their perspective, all they've got is a string, and they're just trying to describe the record.
Right, right.
So I think that we can treat these two together. Do we want to label these as must, should, or may? I certainly have my opinion, which would be that they're both must.
Also for me, it's must.
Yeah.
Any counter opinion?
Yeah, these are key things to an editing system in a linked data environment.
Yeah.
All right. So the next part is, as a cataloger, I know exactly the authoritative term that I want to add as metadata about an entity. And as a cataloger, I know the start of the label of the authoritative term I want to add as metadata about an entity. So I probably should have written these slightly different in terms of to make them I want statements. So instead, it's I want to be able to enter the exact external authoritative label and get the URI linked to the entity being edited.
So I just skimmed down that list, and I noticed that, you know, in the previous example, you're using exact authoritative label and known label. And I wonder if we need to make clear that in some cases, they're going to be looking for a variant label or an alternate label or not the authoritative one. I mean, I don't know if that falls into the keyword searches further down, but I just wanted to throw that out there that these first couple are very clearly using authoritative label.
Right.
And I bring this up because one of the biggest complaints we have about our existing suggest service is that it does not actually search variant labels.
And the suggest service is the one that does left justified?
Yes.
All right, I would say let's do that as a separate line.
Okay. It's a tricky thing because you actually want to search for the variant label, but make it clear that, or at least we would like to make it clear that, you know, you search for gun dogs, but the authoritative term is hunting dogs, type of thing.
All right, so switching these up, I have, as a cataloger, I want to be able to enter the exact external authoritative label and get the URI linked to the entity being edited. And get the URI from the external. Okay. So I want to be able to enter the exact external authoritative label and get the URI from the external authority linked to the entity being edited. Or I want to start typing a known label. I want to start typing a known external authority label and get the URI linked to the authoritative, the entity being edited. Or I want to start typing a known variant external authoritative label and get the URI of the authoritative label linked to the entity being edited. So maybe we should treat those three as a block.
Can I just ask the difference between the one where you're doing an exact and a known is that you start typing a known, and the other one is that you're typing the entire exact?
Yes. So
Okay.
we definitely have a use case where people are typing in the exact label, exactly how it appears with capitalization, commas, and everything. And they want to see the URI actually as the very topmost result in the search results. And then there's the case where they start typing it and it's more of an autocomplete and they want to kind of see it fill in.
Okay, thanks.
I don't know if I have something in there about that. I could add that language as well to sort of make that distinction. So from a cataloger's perspective, is doing the exact authority label and getting back the URI, is that a must or a should? Catalogers?
Should for me.
I'm not technically a cataloger anymore, but I would say should, in part because I think catalogers need to get used to the fact that not every resource is going to have a unique authoritative label. Like this applies for id.loc.gov and things like that, but it won't apply for ISNI or for Wikidata.
Okay.
So actually, I'm no longer, I'm in Christine's track, but I'm no longer a cataloger, but I can say that I know that my catalogers get frustrated when they know the exact term and they type it in and they're not getting it back.
We certainly
Yeah,
got a lot of feedback in working with QA and Sinopia, where that was one of the first things we put in place was if you type it exactly and there's an exact match, it's in the #1 position.
Yeah, to me, I think my catalogers would probably say that was a must.
Let's say it's a must for resources where there is a unique where there is a unique authoritative term, like, because I think we need to make a distinction between preferred labels and unique authoritative terms that only occur once within a set. Yeah, that was definitely a complaint that catalogers that we heard a lot, was that, you know, it wasn't the first result in QA. It's very frustrating when people know something and they can't find the thing that they already have like internalized.
So I added a little caveat on the end there that says this applies when there is a unique authoritative term.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But sorry, what about the case where we have a variant form for the same term? It could be useful to make possible to search for a variant form and to retrieve something that is an authoritative form or not?
Does this mean it here? We did add this line. So I want to start typing a known variant external authoritative label and get the URI of the authoritative label linked to the entity being edited. Is that what you're talking about, Tatiana?
Yes, probably yes. In part is this, and additional function is when the term is in a hierarchical structure, because we are managing now, for example, the case where I want to search, for example, for a designer, but without specifying if he's a graphical designer, a software designer, or a photographer designer, and so on. So what about to search something that is broader than its terms and that include all narrower term, for example? Yes, exactly.
So in that case, would you get a list of the narrower terms?
This could be very useful.
Well, yeah, I can say, because Mesh is designed this way, and I can tell you that is something that people use a lot.
Okay.
And in terms of the variants, I'm just thinking, and this may be out of scope, but in terms of the variants, I would want something that indicated to me that what I'm getting, the result I'm getting, because if I put in tumor and I get back neoplasms, I'm going to look at that, and if I don't know, I'm going to say, well, these are two entirely different things. So I would want something to indicate that what I searched was a variant of the authoritative term.
Yeah, and I think that's similar to the use case about keyword results and surfacing the reasons for getting keyword results. I'm not sure if these are the same thing or distinct. One last.
I'm sorry, Christine, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it could be something as simple as saying, you know, in the search results, saying variant of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is probably a specialized case of the extended context that gets included, but I think that's worth sort of teasing out, because it is something the user typed. And so I think it's a higher level of information that they would want to know, why am I seeing this other term when I type something completely different? So this is the way I worded it, and see if this makes sense to you, Nancy. I said I wanted additional information in the search that indicates that the term listed has a variant that matches the keyword typed.
or is a, that the, hold on, I want additional information searches indicates that the term listed.
Because you select the term,
Right,
not
right,
the
right. Yes,
variant.
okay.
So it's saying that you're seeing this particular term because you typed this variant.
Right. Yeah, that's fine. Took me a minute to process it. Sorry.
Sure. There's a lot of words in these
To
examples.
nitpick,
So I want to back
It's
up for a
almost-
second, just because we have processed a few of these, and I want to get our must or should or may labels on them. So I want to start typing a known external label and get the URI for from the external authority linked to the entity. Must, should.
A must for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think all of the ones that we just did are must.
I would agree with that.
I want to talk about another edge case in these ones. There's certain terms that people know the code, but not the label. Was that, it's kind of like, it's a type of variant. So, and also in like Wikidata, I can see like catalogers type in the Q number instead of the label.
Yeah, that's what I mean, that's what I was thinking of here, is that there are definitely Q numbers that people memorize. The way that they memorize authoritative, you know,
Yeah.
the way that they memorize LCSH or like mark tags.
Yes. I guess those are identifiers, not the code. Codes are thinking like, you know, your.
I put it as an
code
alternate identifier so as not to be confused with an ID or the URI. So I put it as I want to type in an alternate identifier with the example being a Q label. Is there another example we want to put in here?
It could be a code like EN for English.
Right. I mean, there's lots of codes that they memorize. They're kind of used to. Well, it's like how they do it now. So but they're just typing the code in. So they kind of wanted to resolve the same way as a label.
Yeah, language codes, country codes, and edge case, but I think there's a chance that you would have something like an ISNI number, which is technically the preferred label in ISNI, but nobody thinks of it that way.
One
Organization codes, that was good.
For Wikidata, there's a difference between the QID for an item and, for example, typing in EN for the language code, right? Because the QID very specifically only ever identifies one item. And it's always like you basically tell it, yes, I know what I'm doing and use this one. Whereas for English, it will still give you the suggester and you have to pick it, right? I'm not sure if that makes a difference here.
I did wonder about language code just because it is so expansive that, you know, if you put in EN for English, unless you're putting in a whole bunch of other stuff, it's almost more of a filter than an alternate identifier, because the language code doesn't identify a specific item. It more filters down what items you get back. So I wonder if these are two different things, whereas the Q label and the ISNI label are basically going to identify one thing and you get it back.
Oh, I was mostly thinking of like a language code or a country code when in the case where you were looking up an entity for a language or a country. So, I mean, if that confuses things, we don't have to include them.
Maybe we'll just, I think that example would fit, but maybe we'll leave them out just so as not to cause confusion. So is that a must or a should or a may?
This had better be a must after all that discussion.
I'd say it's a must the way that the one about authoritative labels is a must.
Yes, must. Must also for me.
All right. I will tell you that as a developer, when I start hearing everything is a must, It makes it challenging to sort of tease out like how you would go about prioritizing what goes in when. But we can leave it that way and always come back and sort of shift them. Maybe add another layer.
On that note, Lynette.
Definite must.
Right. On that note, Lynette, let me begin by saying I think the next one should at most be a may.
I want to be able to search for a broader term in a hierarchy and get a list of narrower terms.
Let me actually ask this question because I was looking at this one and it came up. So we're writing from the user stories are from a cataloger's perspective. Are we imagining them being inside of a text field in an editor when they express this wish?
Yes, so I would say that inside an editor, yes. Inside a text field, maybe. Certainly from Sanopia's perspective, we are exploring moving away from just typing in a text field to having an actual lookup modal so that there can be a lot more functionality provided than simply an autocomplete type experience. It facilitates adding in things like pagination, and it makes it a little easier to show extended context. It also makes things like navigating a hierarchy. If you know the authority is a hierarchy, you can have this ability to sort of step into terms that are broader or narrower. So I think it is a little more complex than just limiting it to a text field.
Okay, thanks.
So would a cataloger be able to see the hierarchy? So, and I'm just gonna, I guess I can use Getty AAT as an example in Mesh as well, where when you search a term in their browsers, in our browsers, you can choose to view the hierarchy of broader and narrower terms. I think in Mesh you may get it automatically. I think in Getty you have the option to view it. So I'm just wondering how that works, and I'm also wondering if in that case, is there a scenario when you want to actually send the user to the external browser, to the external source, rather than trying to incorporate into your programming all that complexity?
So I added, as a cataloger, I want to click a URL and be transferred to the external authorities URL online search. And I also added, as a cataloger, I want to be able to see broader and narrower terms when the authority is hierarchical. And I also will add,
So I'll comment that I don't think a cataloger wants to be sent to the external resource. I'm wondering if the programmer would prefer the cataloger go to the, because I don't think a cataloger wants to have to go around, jump around between the external. So personally, I think that's more clicks probably than they want, but I'm just wondering if it's feasible to expect to be able to show the cataloger in whatever platform you've created the narrow and broader terms. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm not.
yeah, so I'm going to adjust it slightly if I can't get enough information in the editor application.
Yeah, that's better.
Because that does, I do think that if the cataloger can't get what they need from the editor, having a URL where all they have to do is click it and be sent to the external authority is something that they would want. They might prefer it to happen inside the editor, but if they can't get in the editor, having a quick way to get to the external authority, I think is valuable. So we've done a couple now. I want to back up and do our shoulds and musts. So we had one vote for the broader term in the hierarchy to get a list of narrower terms from which to select. There's been one vote of that for a May.
Right. Let me just expand on that very briefly. The reason for that is because we implemented something similar. It wasn't part of the the text field itself or the dropdown itself, but we implemented this sidecar pop-up that would display some extra information to help catalogers determine whether or not that was the correct entity the cataloger was looking for. In any event, the reason I say may is because we experienced, and therefore the catalogers experienced, a pretty big penalty hit the moment we wanted to start showing broader and narrower terms in this fashion, the moment we started allowing that type of additional search to happen.
Right penalty? Are you
for a
talking
variety of
performance penalty?
Yeah,
Sorry?
it was really slow. I mean, it was like
Yeah.
multiple seconds versus, milliseconds. So it was a huge difference.
Yeah. And it became very painful and somewhat unwieldy too, because you would land on something like music, and I don't know if anyone's ever looked up the narrowers of music, but it's a good number.
Yep. Yeah, we had that with AT as well. We in the new UI, I've linked to an example in the chat. It only displays in poof, your performance goes totally out of the window.
So I would wonder, with that in mind, if all of the broader and narrowers are have the potential to have some performance issues. I also wonder if that has to do with indexing. Did you guys implement it in such a way that you're indexing so the particular term that you got to had the broader and narrower terms indexed into it?
I will say that there was an element to it that is just inherent to our system. So the system itself resolves broaders and narrowers on the fly. So whenever you visit a page at id.loc.gov, those broader and narrower links have not been pre-computed. They're determined right on the fly, which is something that we've had to do just because of how frequently the data is updated and those relationships change. So one of the reasons I say may is if you built a system where all of those links were pre-computed, certainly the penalty would be less. I still think there'd be a penalty, but it would certainly be less, and it may be less enough to be tolerable.
So catalogers, how do you feel about the broader and narrower stuff all being labeled as may?
I'm okay with, personally, I'm okay with may, and I think because it's more for users than broader or narrower terms than it is for the catalogers, at least in our case, who tend to have a good handle on the vocabulary itself.
I agree. Also because probably we will have some additional way to find something. So may it's a good choice.
Yeah, I think May is good here. I think the emphasis is on, for catalogers, is on finding terms that they already know, and I feel like this is sort of the opposite of that.
All right.
Not to throw in yet another spanner in the works, but instead of must, should, may, what about must have, would like to have? As a cataloger, I want to, I would like to be able to do this. As opposed to, as a cataloger, I cannot fulfill my role unless I have this. And as a cataloger, it could be kind of cute if I could do this, but it isn't a big deal. At which point, this would be from a cataloger perspective, this would be a desirable feature, as opposed to something that would be cute, as opposed to something
or in some cases, like the broader narrower thing, it might be, this is an option that I would consider turning on depending on the circumstances, versus this isn't the default behavior that I'd want to see.
Yep, that's a great way of thinking about it.
Things like broader and narrower or going to external sources are like, I feel like those are behaviors that we see when someone has exhausted other options. and they're not like the typical workflow. And I have to run now that we're past the hour.
Yes, I did not notice the time. So I think we're gonna stop here. We'll pick up with this next time. So I want to thank everybody for coming, and I think we're off to a good start on getting things narrowed down. So thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.